The morning mist clung to the courthouse steps like a burial shroud as Robert Mitchell stood at the edge of the gathering crowd, his calloused hands trembling around a crumpled piece of paper. The foreclosure notice bore yesterday's date, its red stamp as final as a death warrant. Behind him, the town of Cedar Falls, Montana, stretched out in shades of brown and gray, a place where dreams came to die under the weight of failed harvests and broken promises. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The auctioneer's voice carried across the square with practiced authority, each word sharp enough to cut through the thick September air. Ladies and gentlemen, we have one final item this morning. One healthy young woman, age 18, skilled in domestic arts, educated beyond the common standard for her station. Opening bid set at $300. Robert's stomach turned. To lead. 18 years of bedtime stories, scraped knees he'd bandaged, proud moments watching her recite poetry at the schoolhouse, all reduced to this moment, this unthinkable transaction that would haunt him until his dying breath. But the bank notice in his coat pocket burned hotter than his shame, and the empty pantry back home spoke louder than his conscience. The year was 1889, and the unforgiving Montana Territory had claimed another victim. 3 months earlier, when the spring thaw had filled Robert Mitchell with cautious optimism, the world had seemed manageable. His modest ranch sat in a valley where the grass grew thick and the stream ran clear year-round. The cattle grazed contentedly, and his daughter Sarah helped tend the vegetable garden that provided most of their food. Life was simple but sufficient. Sarah Mitchell possessed the kind of beauty that seemed almost out of place in their rough surroundings. Her auburn hair caught sunlight like copper wire, and her green eyes held an intelligence that made the local schoolmaster shake his head in wonder. At 18, she could recite Shakespeare as easily as she could birth a calf, cook a meal that would satisfy a dozen ranch hands, or calculate the household accounts with startling accuracy. "Papa," she'd said that morning in June, standing in the doorway of their small cabin with flour dusting her apron, "Mr. Henderson from the bank was here again while you were checking the north pasture." Robert had felt his chest tighten. Henderson's visits had become increasingly frequent, each one bringing news that carved away another piece of Robert's hope. The drought of the previous summer had killed half their herd. The harsh winter that followed had claimed most of the rest. Spring should have brought renewal, but instead it brought creditors and demands for payment that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the sense they made to a man whose wealth existed in land and livestock rather than cash. What did he want this time? Robert had asked. Though he already knew the answer, Sarah's expression had grown careful, the way it did when she was trying to protect him from harsh realities. He says the extension they granted in March was the final one. The full amount is due by September 1st, or she'd trailed off, unable to voice the threat they both understood, or they would lose everything. Robert had built the ranch with his own hands after returning from the war, each fence post and cabin log representing months of back-breaking labor. He'd married Mary Caldwell in the spring of 1870, and together they'd carved out a life from the unforgiving wilderness. When Sarah was born the following year, their small family had felt complete, but Mary's death from influenza, when Sarah was only 12, had left Robert struggling to manage both the practical demands of ranching and the emotional needs of a growing daughter. He'd done his best, but there were gaps in Sarah's upbringing that he couldn't fill, feminine wisdom and social graces that a rough-handed cattleman simply couldn't provide. Still, Sarah had thrived despite the circumstances. She'd absorbed knowledge, like parched earth absorbing rain, reading every book she could find and asking questions that sometimes left Robert speechless. The traveling preacher who visited Cedar Falls quarterly had once told Robert that Sarah possessed a mind too fine for frontier life, that she belonged in one of the eastern cities where education and culture were valued. The comment had filled Robert with both pride and melancholy. Pride because his daughter was exceptional, and melancholy because he knew he could never give her the opportunities she deserved. Now, as the creditors closed in like wolves circling wounded prey, even keeping Sarah fed and sheltered was becoming impossible. The ranch's decline had been gradual at first, then catastrophically sudden. The drought had started in late spring, when the rains that should have nourished the grasslands simply failed to come. Day after day, Robert had scanned the cloudless sky, watching the sun burn his pastures from green to brown to grey. The cattle had grown thin, their ribs visible beneath dusty hides. He'd sold what livestock he could, but drought affected everyone in the territory. Prices plummeted as desperate ranchers flooded the market with cattle they couldn't afford to feed. What should have brought enough money to carry them through the winter barely covered their most pressing debts. The winter of 1888 had been brutal even by Montana standards. Snow fell from October through April, piling so deep that Robert sometimes couldn't reach his remaining cattle for days at a time. When spring finally arrived, he discovered that most of his herd had simply disappeared, either frozen or wandered off in search of shelter that didn't exist. The bank had been patient at first. Henderson, a thin man with nervous eyes and ink-stained fingers, had spoken sympathetically about temporary setbacks and the cyclical nature of ranching. But patience had limits, and those limits were measured in dollars and deadlines rather than human sympathy. "I understand your situation, Mr. Mitchell," Henderson had said during his most recent visit, his voice carrying the rehearsed sympathy of a man who delivered similar news to dozens of families. "But the bank has obligations to its depositors. We can't extend credit indefinitely, especially when there's no clear path to repayment." Robert had stood in his kitchen, hat in hand like a supplicant, while this soft-handed city man explained why his life's work would be sold to satisfy debts he'd never wanted to accumulate. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had survived Confederate bullets and hostile Indians was being defeated by pieces of paper and columns of numbers. "There might be another option," Henderson had said, his tone becoming even more careful. "Your daughter is of marriageable age, and there are men in the territory who would pay handsomely for a wife with her qualities." The suggestion had hit Robert like a physical blow. "Sarah is not for sale." "Of course not," Henderson had backtracked quickly. "I merely meant that marriage often provides financial security that might benefit both parties. There are respectable men who would treat her well." After Henderson left, Robert had sat on his porch, watching the sunset over land that might not be his much longer. The idea of selling Sarah into marriage felt like a betrayal of everything Mary had wanted for their daughter. But as the weeks passed and no other solutions presented themselves, the unthinkable began to seem inevitable. Sarah, perceptive as always, had noticed her father's growing desperation. She'd begun taking on extra work in town, helping the doctor's wife with her correspondence, and teaching reading to the children of families too poor to send them to the regular school. The few dollars she earned barely made a dent in their mounting debts, but her determination to contribute touched Robert's heart even as it broke it. "Papa," she'd said one evening in late August, "Mrs. Crawford mentioned that her cousin in Denver is looking for a governess for his children. The position includes room and board, and the salary would be enough to send money home." Robert had looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and seen not the child he remembered, but a young woman prepared to sacrifice her own future to save his failing ranch. The realization had filled him with both pride and shame so intense it was almost unbearable. "That's generous of Mrs. Crawford to think of you," he'd said carefully, "but Denver is a long way from home. Distance doesn't matter if it means we can keep the ranch." Sarah had replied, with the practical wisdom that made her seem older than her years. Besides, it would only be temporary, once things improve here. But they both knew things weren't going to improve. The ranch was dying, had been dying for months, and no amount of wishful thinking would change that reality. That night, alone in his bed, Robert had made the decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. If Sarah was determined to sacrifice herself for his failures, at least he could ensure she received the highest possible price. The cattle auction happened every month in Cedar Falls, drawing buyers from across the territory. Men came looking for livestock, but they also came looking for other things: wives, servants, women, to help tame the wilderness. The thought made him physically ill, but desperation had a way of making the unthinkable seem reasonable. He'd approached the auctioneer, a weathered man named Briggs, who'd been conducting sales in Cedar Falls for over a decade. Briggs had listened to Robert's proposal with the detached professionalism of someone who'd seen every possible human transaction. "I understand your situation," Briggs had said, "and I won't pretend it's uncommon, but are you certain this is what you want? Once it's done, there's no taking it back." Robert had thought about Mary, about the promises he'd made at her deathbed, to protect their daughter and see her properly settled. He'd thought about the ranch they'd built together, the dreams they'd shared, the future they'd planned that was now crumbling around him. "I'm certain," he'd lied. The morning of the auction dawned clear and cold, with the promise of an early winter in the air. Robert had watched Sarah prepare herself with the same careful attention she brought to every task. She'd chosen her best dress, a blue wool garment that Mary had sewn years earlier and that Sarah had carefully maintained and altered as she grew. Her hair was braided and pinned in a style that made her look both younger and older than her 18 years. "You don't have to do this, Papa," she'd said quietly as they walked toward town. "We could try the governor's position in Denver, or I could marry Thomas Garrett. He's asked twice now, and his farm is doing well enough." Thomas Garrett was the son of a neighboring rancher, a solid young man who'd been courting Sarah with earnest determination for the past year. He was kind, hard-working, and utterly devoted to her. He was also painfully ordinary, with no appreciation for Sarah's quick mind or unusual education. Marrying him would mean a secure but limited life, helping him run his farm and bearing his children, while her own potential withered from neglect. "Thomas is a good man," Robert had said, "but you deserve better than settling for security." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What he didn't say was that he'd already tried approaching Thomas about an arrangement that would pay off the ranch debts. The Garrett family, while comfortable, didn't have the kind of money Robert needed. Thomas could offer Sarah a decent life, but he couldn't save the ranch. As they'd reached the outskirts of town, Robert had seen the crowds already gathering in the courthouse square. Ranchers and farmers mingled with men whose soft hands and fine clothes marked them as having money to spend. Some had come for livestock, others for equipment, and a few had come for opportunities that wouldn't be listed in any respectable newspaper. The auction had proceeded according to its usual pattern: cattle and horses first, then farm equipment, household goods, and finally the items that drew the most intense and uncomfortable attention. Robert had watched from the edge of the crowd as families were torn apart by financial necessity, as children were bound out to work for strangers, as the debris of failed dreams was sold to the highest bidder. When Sarah's turn came, she'd walked to the auction block with her head held high, every line of her posture radiating a dignity that made Robert's heart break. She'd refused to look at him, but he could see the slight tremor in her hands that betrayed her fear. The bidding had started slowly, but as men in the crowd began to appreciate Sarah's unusual combination of beauty and education, the price had climbed steadily. 300 became 400, then 500, then 600. Robert had found himself simultaneously grateful for the high price and sickened by what it represented. At $700, most of the bidders had fallen away, priced out by sums that represented more money than many of them would see in years. Only 3 men remained in the competition. Marcus Webb, a cattleman from the eastern part of the territory, known for his harsh treatment of employees. Jonas Fletcher, a saloon owner from Billings whose intentions were obviously dishonorable. And a stranger who'd appeared at the back of the crowd just as the bidding reached serious levels. The stranger was different from the others in ways that went beyond his obvious wealth. While Webb and Fletcher studied Sarah with calculating eyes that made Robert's skin crawl, the stranger stared at her with an expression that seemed almost shocked, as if he were seeing something impossible. He was perhaps 40 years old, with silver threading through dark hair and clothes that spoke of eastern cities and serious money. Everything about him suggested success and respectability, but there was something in his eyes, a kind of desperate recognition that set him apart from the typical auction crowd. 800, the stranger called out when Webb's bid reached. 750. The amount sent murmurs through the crowd. $800 was more money than most people in Cedar Falls would see in their entire lives. It was enough to pay off Robert's debts and leave money for a fresh start somewhere else. 900, Webb counted, his face flushed with determination and something darker. 1,000, the stranger responded immediately, his voice carrying an authority that suggested he had much more where that came from. The crowd fell silent. $1,000 was an almost mythical sum in their world, enough to buy a small ranch or start a business in one of the growing cities. Webb stared at the stranger with frustrated anger, recognizing that he'd been outclassed by someone playing with entirely different resources. As the auctioneer called for higher bids that wouldn't come, Robert found himself studying the stranger more carefully. There was something familiar about him, though Robert was certain they'd never met. The shape of his jaw, perhaps, or the way he carried himself with unconscious authority. "Sold to the gentleman in the grey coat for $1,000, Briggs announced, his gavel falling with the finality of a judge's sentence. But instead of stepping forward to claim his purchase, the stranger did something that confused everyone. "You're present." He walked directly to Sarah, stopping just close enough to speak without being overheard. Robert watched as the man's lips moved, saw Sarah's eyes widen in shock, and then witnessed something extraordinary. Sarah began to cry, not the quiet tears of resignation she'd been fighting all morning, but deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place beyond grief. Through her tears, she whispered something back that made the stranger stagger as if he'd been struck. The crowd began to murmur with growing excitement, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding before their eyes. Robert pushed forward, desperate to understand what was happening to his daughter, what this stranger had said to provoke such a reaction. As he got closer, he caught fragments of their conversation over the noise of the crowd. "I thought you were dead," Sarah was saying, her voice thick with tears and disbelief. "I thought I'd never find you," the stranger replied, and Robert could see that his eyes were wet too. "When I heard about the auction, when I read the description, I had to come. I had to see if it was really possible." 19 years, Sarah whispered. 19 years I've wondered who you were." The stranger nodded, his careful composure finally cracking completely. "I looked everywhere, every town, every territory. Your mother moved so many times, changed names so often. I hired investigators, placed advertisements in newspapers, but she was always one step ahead." Robert felt the world tilt beneath his feet. The stranger was talking about Mary, his wife, Sarah's mother, but that was impossible. Mary had been a widow when he met her, had told him Sarah's father died in a mining accident before she was born. She'd never mentioned anyone looking for them, never suggested that Sarah's father might still be alive. She told me you were dead, Sarah said, her voice carrying both accusation and understanding. She said you died in a cave-in at the copper mine before I was born. The stranger shook his head slowly. I knew about you from the moment she told me she was carrying my child. I wanted to marry her, Sarah. I begged her to let me take care of both of you. But she said my family would never accept her, that it was better if I just disappeared. Around them, the crowd was growing restless, unable to understand why the highest bidder wasn't completing his transaction. Briggs stepped down from his platform, his expression confused and slightly irritated. "Excuse me, sir," he said to the stranger. "If you're having second thoughts about your purchase, there are other interested parties who—" "I'm not having second thoughts," the stranger said firmly, never taking his eyes off Sarah. "But I'm not here to buy a servant. I'm here to claim my daughter." The words hit the crowd like a thunderclap. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, and every person in the square turned to stare at the scene unfolding near the auction block. Robert felt his legs give way entirely, and he sank onto a nearby wooden crate, his mind reeling. Sarah's father. This wealthy stranger who just paid $1,000 for her was claiming to be her biological father. The father Mary had told them both was dead. "That's impossible," Robert managed to say, his voice weak with shock. "Mary told me," she said. The stranger finally turned to look at him, and Robert saw a mixture of pity and understanding in his dark eyes. "Mary told you many things that weren't strictly true, Mr. Mitchell. She was protecting Sarah, and she was protecting herself. And me, I suppose." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, he extracted a small photograph. Its edges yellowed with age. He handed it to Sarah, who took it with trembling fingers. Robert couldn't see the image from where he sat, but he watched Sarah's face as she studied it. Her breath caught, and she pressed the photograph to her chest as if it were something precious beyond measure. "That's your mother," the stranger said quietly. "Mary Catherine Brennan, before she became Mary Mitchell. She was 20 when that was taken, about 6 months before you were born. I've carried it with me every day for 19 years, hoping that someday I'd be able to show it to you." Sarah looked up at him through her tears. "What's your name?" "Daniel," he said. "Daniel Harrison. And you're Sarah Catherine Harrison, not Sarah Mitchell. You're my daughter, and I've been searching for you since the day you were born." The revelation rippled through the assembled crowd like wildfire through dry grass. Daniel Harrison, a name that carried weight even in the remote territories of Montana. Robert's weathered hands gripped the edge of the wooden crate as recognition dawned. Harrison owned half the copper mines between Butte and Helena, controlled shipping routes that stretched from the Pacific coast to Chicago, and wielded influence that reached into the halls of Congress itself. Sarah stared at this man who claimed to be her father, her mind struggling to reconcile 19 years of believing herself an orphan with the flesh-and-blood reality standing before her. The photograph trembled in her hands as she studied every detail of her mother's young face, a face she recognized from her own reflection, yet had never seen captured in such vivid happiness. "The mining accident," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mama told me you died in a cave-in at the Anaconda mine. She said she was carrying me when they brought the news." Daniel's face contorted with pain that seemed fresh, despite the passage of years. "There was a cave-in at Anaconda. 3 men died that day, including my foreman and my closest friend. Your mother must have used that tragedy to explain my disappearance from your lives." The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the unfolding drama like moths to flame. Ranchers who'd come to buy cattle found themselves witnesses to something far more compelling than livestock transactions. Women fanned themselves with whatever was handy, their eyes bright with curiosity and sympathy. Marcus Webb, the man who'd been prepared to pay $750 for Sarah, stood near the back, of the gathering with his face twisted into an expression of frustrated anger. He'd lost more than a potential purchase. He'd lost face in front of men who would remember this day and speak of it in saloons and bunkhouses across the territory. "This is highly irregular," Briggs the auctioneer protested, his commercial instincts warring with his fascination at the scene unfolding. "The transaction was completed legally. The young lady was sold to Mr. Harrison for $1,000. "The transaction," Daniel said with quiet authority that cut through the murmuring crowd, "was for the purchase of a servant. I'm not buying. My own daughter. I'm claiming her." Robert finally found his voice, though it emerged as a croak. "Mary never said. In all the years we were married, she never mentioned anyone looking for you, never suggested that Sarah's father might be alive." Daniel turned his attention to Robert, and for the first time, his expression carried something approaching sympathy. Mary was protecting Sarah from a truth she thought would only bring pain, and perhaps she was protecting herself from questions she didn't want to answer. The sun climbed higher in the September sky, casting sharp shadows across the courthouse square as the crowd settled in for what promised to be the most memorable auction day in Cedar Falls history. Children who should have been in school pressed against their mothers' skirts, sensing the importance of what they were witnessing even if they couldn't understand it. "Tell me about her," Sarah said suddenly, her tears finally slowing. "Tell me about Mama when she was young. Tell me how you met." Daniel's stern features softened as memory transformed his expression. "Your mother was the most remarkable woman I'd ever encountered. Beautiful, yes, but that wasn't what captured my attention. She had this way of seeing straight through to the heart of things, of speaking truth even when it wasn't convenient or comfortable." He paused, gathering his thoughts while the crowd waited in respectful silence. Even the most hardened men among them recognized they were witnessing something sacred, the reunion of a father and daughter separated by years of deception and misunderstanding. "I was 22 when I met her, fresh out of the Colorado School of Mines and full of ambition that outweighed my sense. My father had given me a small stake to start my own operation, and I was determined to prove I could build something significant without relying on the Harrison name or fortune." Sarah listened intently, hungry for details about a past that had been hidden from her. Around them, the crowd remained surprisingly quiet, as if understanding that this story belonged to her as much as to the man telling it. Mary worked in a boarding house near the mines, cooking for the miners and keeping the accounts. She was 19, supporting herself and sending money back to her family in Colorado. The first time I saw her, she was arguing with a supplier who was trying to cheat the boarding house on the price of flour. A ghost of a smile crossed Daniel's face at the memory. She had this way of tilting her chin when she was angry, exactly the way you did just now when the auctioneer questioned my right to claim you. She told that supplier exactly what she thought of his business practices, and by the time she was finished, he was not only apologizing, but offering to throw in an extra sack of flour at no charge. Robert listened to this description of a Mary he'd never known, bold, independent, unafraid to stand up for herself. The woman he'd married had been gentler, more cautious, as if life had taught her to be wary of drawing too much attention. "I started eating my meals at that boarding house," Daniel continued, "even though it was a mile out of my way. I told myself it was because the food was better than anywhere else, but really, it was because I wanted to watch Mary work. She had this gift for making everyone feel welcome, for turning a simple meal into something that felt like family." Sarah's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where a small scar marked a childhood accident. "She used to sing while she cooked," she said softly, "Irish songs that her grandmother taught her. She said music made everything taste better." "The Water is Wide," Daniel said immediately. "That was her favorite. She sang it every morning." while she prepared breakfast for the miners. The recognition hit Sarah like a physical blow. That song, her mother had hummed it countless times while working in their kitchen, but she'd never taught Sarah the words. Now she understood why. It carried memories too painful to share. "When did you know you loved her?" Sarah asked, and the crowd leaned in unconsciously, caught up in this love story that had produced the young woman standing before them. Daniel's expression grew distant as he traveled back through the years. "There was a mine accident in early spring. Not the one your mother told you about, but a smaller collapse that trapped 4 men. I was underground when it happened, helping with the rescue efforts. We worked for 18 hours straight, digging, through rock and timber, not knowing if we'd find the men alive or dead." His voice grew rougher with emotion. "When we finally broke through and brought them to the surface, Mary was there with hot coffee and blankets. She'd been waiting all night, taking care of the families, keeping the children calm. She looked at me with dirt on my face and blood on my hands, and she didn't see a mine owner's son playing at being a businessman. She saw someone who'd risked his life for his workers." The silence stretched across the square as Daniel gathered himself to continue. "That's when I knew I'd marry her if she'd have me. That's when I knew I'd found the woman I wanted to build a life with." "But your family opposed the match," Robert said quietly, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together in his mind. Daniel's jaw tightened. "My father saw Mary as a temporary distraction. He expected me to marry within our social circle, the daughter of another mining family or a railroad baron, someone who could bring connections and dowry to strengthen the Harrison interests." The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable. "When I told him I intended to marry Mary Brennan, he made his position very clear. Either I ended the relationship immediately, or I could expect to be cut off from the family fortune entirely." Sarah absorbed this information, understanding for the first time the impossible choice her parents had faced. "You chose her anyway." "I tried to," Daniel said. "I proposed to Mary on a Sunday evening in June, told her I'd rather build a life with her than inherit one without her. She said yes, but even in that moment I could see the fear in her eyes." The crowd stirred restlessly as the drama continued to unfold. Some of the cattlemen were growing impatient, wanting to complete their own business, but most remained captivated by the unfolding reunion. "What happened then?" Sarah asked, though something in her expression suggested she dreaded the answer. "We planned a simple wedding for the end of July, nothing elaborate, just the preacher and a few friends. Mary insisted she didn't need fancy trappings as long as we were together." Daniel's voice grew heavy with regret. "But my father wasn't finished with his manipulations." He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a folded letter, its paper yellow with age. 2 weeks before our wedding, Mary disappeared. She left this for me at the boarding house." Sarah took the letter with reverence, as if handling a sacred relic. The handwriting was unmistakably her mother's, the same careful script that had filled the margins of Sarah's schoolbooks with encouraging notes. "My dearest Daniel," Sarah read aloud, her voice growing stronger as she gave voice to her mother's words. "By the time you read this, I will be gone from Colorado and from your life. Please don't try to find me. This decision breaks my heart, but I cannot be the reason you lose your family and your future." The crowd had gone completely silent now, understanding they were witnessing something intensely private, yet universally human. The reading of a love letter written 19 years ago by a woman who'd sacrificed her own happiness to protect the man she loved. Sarah continued reading, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "Your father came to see me yesterday. He made it clear that marrying you would mean financial ruin for your mining operations, social ostracism for your family, and the end of your dreams of expanding into new territories. He offered me $500 to disappear, but I would never take money for walking away from love." A gasp went up from several women in the crowd. $500 in 1870 would have been a fortune to a working woman like Mary, enough to start a new life anywhere she chose. Instead, I'm taking only what I brought to this place, my hopes for our child and my love for you, which I will carry until my dying day. Please forgive me for not being brave enough to fight for us. Please try to understand that sometimes the deepest love requires the greatest sacrifice. Sarah's voice broke on the final lines. Build your empire, my darling. Marry someone worthy of your name. Be happy. And if you ever think of the Irish girl who loved you, remember that she believed you were destined for greatness. With all my love, Mary Catherine Brennan. The silence that followed was profound. Even the children in the crowd seemed to understand that they had witnessed something sacred, the reading of a love letter that had shaped 3 lives across 19 years of separation. Daniel's face was wet with tears. He made no attempt to hide. I searched for 6 months before business obligations forced me to return to my father's operations. But I never stopped looking. Every time I heard of an Irish woman with red hair in a new territory, I investigated. Every birth record, every marriage certificate, every newspaper notice. I searched them all. She changed her name, Robert said, quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. When I met her, she was Mary Caldwell. She said she'd been married before, that her husband died in an accident. Caldwell was her mother's maiden name, Daniel confirmed, and in a sense, part of her did die when she left Colorado. The woman you married was carrying wounds I never understood until today. Sarah looked between the 2 men who had shaped her life. Robert, who had raised her with patient love, despite having no obligation to do so, and Daniel, who had searched for her across 2 decades without knowing if she was even alive. Why? Didn't she tell me? Sarah asked, her voice small and confused. Why let me grow up believing my father was dead when she knew you were looking for us? Daniel's expression grew infinitely sad. Because she probably believed I'd moved on. Married someone else. Built the empire she told me to build. She couldn't have known that every success I achieved was hollow without her and you to share it. The auctioneer Briggs cleared his throat nervously. Folks, we still have livestock to sell and the day's getting on. Perhaps this reunion could continue somewhere more private. But Daniel shook his head. No, this started in public and it needs to be resolved in public. Too many secrets have shaped our lives. No more. He turned to address the crowd directly, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command. Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed something extraordinary today. This young woman is my daughter, Sarah Catherine Harrison, and she will never again be subject to auction or sale by anyone. The legal implications of his words rippled through the crowd. If Sarah was truly Daniel Harrison's legitimate daughter, then Robert's right to sell her became questionable at best. A father's authority superseded a stepfather's, especially when the biological father had the wealth and influence to make his claims stick in court. Mr. Mitchell, Daniel said, turning to Robert with an expression that mixed gratitude with determination. You've cared for my daughter when I couldn't. You've given her education, love, and moral guidance that shaped her into the remarkable woman she's become. That debt can never be repaid. Robert met his eyes, seeing sincerity there that surprised him. I loved her like my own blood. That's not going to change, no matter what happens now. I'm glad to hear that, Daniel replied, because I hope it won't have to change. Sarah belongs with her family, all of her family. The question is what we do now to honor both the past and the future. Sarah looked around the courthouse square, at the faces of neighbors who'd known her all her life, at the strangers who'd witnessed her transformation from auction item to acknowledged heiress. The weight of decision pressed down on her shoulders, like a physical burden. I need time, she said finally. This is too much to absorb all at once. 19 years of believing one thing, and now—" Daniel nodded immediately. "Of course, you can have all the time you need, but I want you to know one thing above all else." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to carry only to Sarah and Robert. "I never stopped loving you. Not for a single day. Every choice I've made, every dollar I've earned, every moment of success or failure, it's all been with the hope that someday I'd find you and be able to give you the world." Sarah's composure finally cracked completely. She stepped forward into the embrace of the father she'd never known she had, and Daniel's arms came around her as if he'd never let her go again. Over her shoulder, his eyes met Robert's, and in that gaze, Robert saw determination, gratitude, and a promise that Sarah's future would be everything her past had not been able to provide. The crowd began to disperse slowly, buzzing with excitement over the drama they'd witnessed. This story would be told and retold in every saloon, church, and general store across the territory. The day Sarah Mitchell became Sarah Harrison would become legend. But for the three people at the center of it all, the real work was just beginning. 19 years of separation couldn't be bridged in a single afternoon, and the future they would build together remained unwritten. As the courthouse square emptied, Sarah Harrison took her first steps toward a destiny she'd never imagined possible. Supported by two fathers who loved her enough to put her happiness above their own desires, the auction was over. Her real life was about to begin. The carriage that bore the Harrison crest rolled through the gates of Copper Ridge Estate as the afternoon sun painted the Montana mountains in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah pressed her face to the window, watching servants in crisp uniforms tend to gardens that seemed to stretch beyond the horizon. Everything here spoke of wealth so vast, it defied her rural understanding. A world where money flowed like water and comfort was taken for granted. 3 days had passed since the auction that changed everything. 3 days of Daniel Harrison waiting patiently in Cedar Falls' finest hotel, while Sarah grappled with decisions that would reshape her entire existence. He'd spent his mornings walking the town's dusty streets, his afternoons sitting on Robert's front porch sharing stories of Mary that Sarah had never heard, and his evenings alone with thoughts of a future he'd dreamed about for 19 years. Robert sat beside her in the carriage, his calloused hands folded tightly in his lap. Daniel had insisted he come along, saying that any conversation about Sarah's future needed to include the man who'd shaped her past. But Robert looked profoundly uncomfortable, surrounded by such luxury, his work clothes seeming rough against the carriage's fine leather upholstery. The main house was completed in 1885, Daniel said, his voice carrying pride mixed with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. 43 rooms, including a library with over 5,000 books and a music conservatory where my mother used to play before. He trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Sarah caught the hesitation. Before what? Daniel gazed out at the approaching mansion, its stone facade gleaming in the fading light. Before I disappointed her with my choices, before I fell in love with a woman she deemed unsuitable for the Harrison name. The massive structure that came into view took Sarah's breath away. It rose 4 stories high with turrets and balconies that belonged in European fairy tales rather than the American frontier. Stained glass windows caught the light like jewels, and manicured lawns rolled away in every direction like green carpet. The carriage came to a stop before entrance doors that could have accommodated a small barn. Immediately, servants appeared to help them down, their movements synchronized and efficient in ways that spoke of long training and strict supervision. Mr. Harrison, an elderly man in immaculate formal wear, greeted them. "Welcome home, sir." "Thank you, Bishop," Daniel replied warmly. "This is my daughter Sarah, and Mr. Mitchell, who raised her. Please see that they're made comfortable in the Blue Wing, the suite with the mountain view." Bishop's eyes widened almost imperceptibly at the word daughter, but his professional composure never wavered. "Of course, sir. Dinner will be served at 7, if that's acceptable." As they climbed the front steps, Sarah noticed Daniel's posture, changing subtly. The easy confidence he'd displayed over the past few days was replaced by something more guarded, more careful. She realized that this homecoming wasn't entirely comfortable for him either. The interior of the house overwhelmed Sarah's senses. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow patterns on marble floors, polished to mirror brightness. Paintings in elaborate, golden frames lined walls that stretched up to impossibly high ceilings, and a grand staircase curved upward like something from a palace. But what struck Sarah most was the silence. Despite its grandeur, the house felt empty, almost hollow. Their footsteps echoed in ways that suggested these magnificent rooms were rarely filled with laughter or conversation. "It's impressive," Sarah said carefully, "but it doesn't feel like a home. It feels like a monument." Daniel's expression grew thoughtful. "That's exactly what my father always intended. He believed that a man's house should reflect his achievements, should intimidate his competitors and impress his guests. Comfort was secondary to display." "And what do you believe?" Robert asked quietly, speaking for the first time since entering the mansion. Daniel paused at the bottom of the grand staircase, considering the question. "I used to believe the same thing. I thought surrounding myself with beauty and luxury would somehow fill the emptiness that Mary's leaving created. But objects, no matter how magnificent, can't replace the people who give life meaning." They were interrupted by the appearance of a woman in her 50s, dressed in black silk, with silver hair pulled back in an elegant chignon. She moved with the fluid grace of someone born to wealth, but her pale blue eyes held a coldness that made Sarah instinctively step closer to Robert. "Daniel," she said, her voice carrying the refined accent of Boston finishing schools. "I heard you'd returned with unexpected guests." "Aunt Victoria," Daniel replied, his tone carefully neutral. "I'd like you to meet Sarah Harrison, my daughter, and Robert Mitchell, who's been caring for her." The woman's face went through a series of subtle changes, shock giving way to calculation, then settling into something that looked like barely controlled fury. "Your daughter," she repeated, each word precisely enunciated. "Yes, Sarah Catherine Harrison, my daughter with Mary Brennan." Victoria's lips tightened into a thin line. "The Irish seamstress," she said, making the words sound like a disease. "I thought we'd agreed that the unfortunate chapter was permanently closed." Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Daniel stepped forward, his voice carrying a warning edge. "That unfortunate chapter resulted in the most important person in my life, Aunt Victoria. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." The tension in the grand foyer was thick enough to cut. Sarah looked between the two adults, beginning to understand that her arrival here represented more than just a family reunion. She was walking into the middle of a conflict that had been brewing for 19 years. Victoria's gaze shifted to Sarah, studying her with the calculating look of someone appraising livestock. "She has the Brennan look about her," she said finally, the red hair, the stubborn set to her jaw. "I suppose there's no denying the resemblance." "There was never any question about paternity," Daniel said firmly. "I've known Sarah was my daughter since before she was born." "Known, perhaps." Victoria's voice carried 19 years of accumulated frustration, "but acknowledging her publicly is another matter entirely. Do you have any idea what this will do to our standing in society? What will people say when they learn you've suddenly produced an illegitimate daughter?" Sarah flinched at the word, but Robert's hand came to rest gently on her shoulder, steadying her. "I may be many things, ma'am," Sarah said, finding her voice despite her nervousness, "but I'm not illegitimate. My parents loved each other deeply, even if circumstances prevented their marriage. That's more than can be said for many legal unions. I've observed. Victoria's eyebrows rose at Sarah's boldness, but before she could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. Well, well, what have we here? A young man descended the staircase, perhaps 28 years old, with the same dark hair as Daniel, but softer features and clothing that suggested he'd never done a day's physical labor. His smile was charming, but somehow didn't reach his eyes, and there was something in his manner that reminded Sarah uncomfortably of a snake preparing to strike. "Benjamin," Daniel said with obvious reluctance, "I didn't know you were staying. Here." "Aunt Victoria invited me for the month," Benjamin replied, his gaze fixed on Sarah with interest that made her skin crawl. "She said you'd had some sort of business emergency that required immediate attention. She didn't mention it involved." "Such a striking young lady." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Sarah Robert, I'd like you to meet my cousin Benjamin Harrison. Benjamin, this is my daughter Sarah and her guardian Robert Mitchell." Benjamin's charming smile faltered slightly. "Your daughter? I wasn't aware you had any children, cousin." "It's a recent development," Victoria interjected smoothly. "Daniel has decided to acknowledge the child he fathered with a servant girl 19 years ago." The way she said it made Sarah's skin crawl, as if her very existence was something shameful that had to be explained and excused. She could see the calculation behind Benjamin's eyes as he processed this information and its implications for his own position in the family hierarchy. "How progressive of you, Daniel," Benjamin said, his tone suggesting he found the situation more amusing than shocking. "And you've brought her here to live?" "I've brought her here so she can understand her options," Daniel corrected. "The choice of where and how she lives is entirely hers to make." Sarah looked around at the magnificent house, at the family members who clearly saw her as an unwelcome complication, at Robert standing quietly beside her with his honest face and work-hardened hands so obviously out of place among all this finery. "Perhaps we could discuss this over dinner," Daniel suggested, but his voice carried strain. "Sarah and Mr. Mitchell have had a long journey, and I'm sure they'd appreciate the chance to refresh themselves." "Of course," Victoria said, her social training taking over despite her obvious displeasure. "Dinner at 7 as usual. I'll have cook prepare something suitable." As they were shown to their rooms, Sarah caught fragments of heated conversation from the foyer below. Victoria's voice sharp with indignation. 19 years of careful reputation building. Benjamin's smoother tones could be managed with the right approach. And through it all, Daniel's deeper voice, firm but weary. "My decision to make. To see." Blue Wing Suite was larger than Robert's entire cabin. Sarah stood in the center of the sitting room, turning slowly to take in silk wallpaper, furniture that looked like museum pieces, and windows that offered breathtaking views of the mountains. It was beautiful beyond anything she'd ever imagined, but it felt as foreign as if she'd stepped onto another planet. Robert appeared in the connecting doorway, looking as overwhelmed as she felt. "Sarah," he said quietly, "are you certain about this?" She sank into one of the upholstered chairs, suddenly exhausted. "I'm not certain about anything, Robert. 3 days ago I was facing an auction to pay your debts. Now I'm supposedly the daughter of one of the wealthiest men in Montana, sitting in a room that probably costs more than most families see in a lifetime." "That woman downstairs, Victoria," Robert said carefully. "She doesn't want you here." Sarah nodded. "Neither does Benjamin. I can see it in their eyes. They think I'm going to embarrass them or take something that belongs to them." "Maybe they're right to be worried," Robert said, surprising her. "You are going to take something from them. You're going to take Daniel's attention, his affection, probably a share of his inheritance. That threatens everything they've built their lives around." A soft knock interrupted their conversation. "Come in," Sarah called, and a young woman about her own age entered carrying a tea service. She was clearly a servant, but her dress was well made and she moved with quiet confidence. "Mr. Harrison thought you might be refreshed by some tea," the girl said shyly. "I'm Emma, one of the housemaids. If you need anything, just ring the bell by the window." "Thank you, Emma," Sarah said warmly. "This is very thoughtful." Emma smiled, seeming surprised by Sarah's friendly tone. "Are you really Mr. Harrison's daughter?" she asked, then blushed furiously. "I'm sorry, it's not my place to ask, but the whole household is talking about it." "It's all right," Sarah assured her. "Yes, apparently I am, though I only found out 3 days ago myself." Emma's eyes widened. "He talks about you sometimes," she said quietly, glancing toward the door to make sure they wouldn't be overheard. "When he's been drinking his evening. Brandy, he gets this distant look. He'll mention a little girl with red hair that he lost, and how he wonders what became of her." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "He talked about me?" Emma nodded earnestly. "Every year on April 23rd, he gets quiet and melancholy. The staff all know not to bother him much on that day. Now we know why." After Emma left, Sarah sat staring out at the mountain vista, her mother's letter from Daniel still clutched in her hand. April 23rd, her birthday. Daniel had remembered her birthday every year, had carried the sadness of her absence. Through 18 painful anniversaries, the thought filled her with a mixture of warmth and heartbreak. Here was a man who'd spent nearly 2 decades grieving for a daughter he'd never really known, who'd built an empire while carrying the weight of loss and regret. "He's been mourning for you all these years," Robert said softly, reading her thoughts. "All these years, he's been mourning for a daughter he'd never held." Sarah turned to look at this man who'd raised her with patience and love, despite having no obligation to do so. "What about you, Robert? If I stay here, what happens to you?" Robert was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the mountains. "I go back to the ranch, I suppose. Try to make something of what's left. The auction money will keep the creditors away for a while." "Yes, but it won't change the fact that you're getting older, that the land's not producing like it used to. Without me there to help with the household management," he shrugged, "I'll figure something out. I always have." The sadness in his voice broke Sarah's heart. This kind, decent man had sacrificed so much for her over the years, had loved her as completely as any biological father could. Now, she was contemplating leaving him behind for a world of luxury and opportunity. Before she could respond, another knock came at the door. This time it was Daniel himself, now dressed for dinner in formal evening wear that emphasized his resemblance to the portraits she'd seen hanging in the hallways. "I wanted to check on you before dinner," he said, his eyes searching her face, for signs of how she was processing everything. "I know this is overwhelming. Your aunt doesn't want me here," Sarah said directly. "Neither does your cousin." Daniel sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture that made him look younger and more vulnerable. "Victoria has been the lady of this house since my mother died 12 years ago. She's grown comfortable with that role, and she sees you as a threat to her position. As for Benjamin—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Benjamin stands to inherit a significant portion of my estate if I die without direct heirs. Your presence here changes that calculation, so I am a threat to them. You're not a threat, Sarah. You're my daughter, and you have every right to be here. But yes, your existence complicates things for people who've grown comfortable with the way things were." Sarah stood and walked to the window, looking out at gardens where peacocks strutted across perfect lawns. "My mother," she said quietly. "Tell me about why she really left you. Tell me about the pressure your family put on her." Daniel joined her at the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass. "My father was a hard man who believed that business success justified any personal cost. When I told him I intended to marry Mary, he didn't just disapprove, he declared war. What did he do? He threatened to destroy the boarding house where Mary worked, to ruin any business that employed her, to make sure she could never find decent work anywhere in Colorado territory. He had the influence to make good on those threats. Sarah absorbed this information, understanding for the first time the impossible choice her parents had faced. She left to protect you both. She left because she loved me too much to let me choose her over my family's approval. She knew that asking me to give up my inheritance and my future for her would eventually breed resentment between us. She was wiser than I was. She understood that love without security often dies from the strain. A dinner bell chimed somewhere. In the depths of the house, its sound echoing through corridors, Sarah was only beginning to explore. "We should go down," Daniel said. "Victoria prides herself on punctuality, and it's better not to give her additional reasons for displeasure." As they descended the grand staircase, Sarah caught sight of herself in a hallway mirror and was startled by what she saw. Her simple dress, which had seemed appropriate for dinner in Robert's cabin, looked distinctly out of place in these elegant surroundings. Her hair, braided simply and pinned back, seemed provincial compared to the elaborate styles she'd seen in the portraits lining the walls. The dining room was intimidating in its formal grandeur. A table that could have seated 30 was set for 5, with more silverware at each place than Sarah typically used in a week. Crystal glasses caught the light from an enormous chandelier, and servants stood at attention along the walls, ready to anticipate every need. Victoria had changed into an evening gown of deep burgundy silk that must have cost more than Robert. Made in a year. Benjamin wore a dinner jacket that fit him perfectly, probably tailored specifically for his frame. Even Robert had made an effort, wearing his best shirt and the coat he reserved for church services. Sarah felt profoundly underdressed and out of place. "Sarah," Daniel said gently, "please sit here beside me." The placement was clearly significant. By seating Sarah at his right hand, Daniel was making a statement about her importance in his life that wouldn't be lost on anyone at the table. Victoria's lips tightened almost imperceptibly, but she said nothing. The first course was served by silent, efficient servants, and for several minutes the only sounds were the gentle clink of silverware against china. Sarah tried to follow the other's lead about which utensils to use, acutely aware that she was being watched and judged with every bite. "So, Sarah," Benjamin said finally, his tone conversational but with an undertone she didn't like. "Tell us about your education. I assume you've had some schooling." Sarah looked up from her soup, sensing a trap but not sure how to avoid it. The question seemed innocent enough, but something in Benjamin's manner suggested he was probing for weaknesses. "I can read and write," she said carefully. "Robert made sure I learned arithmetic and basic sciences. I've read most of the books in Cedar Falls, though I know that's not saying much compared to—" She gestured vaguely at the opulence surrounding them. "How thorough," Benjamin said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And what sort of books would those be?" Sarah felt her cheeks warm, knowing he was trying to embarrass her, to highlight the differences between her rural education and what someone of his class would consider proper learning. "The Bible, of course," she said evenly. "Some Shakespeare, though the language is challenging. Several novels by Charles Dickens and Mark Twain, books on history and geography when I could find them. Poetry by Longfellow and Whitman." Daniel looked pleased by her answer, but Victoria seemed unimpressed. "Can you speak French?" Victoria asked. "Play piano? Paint watercolors?" "No, ma'am. I never had the opportunity to learn those things." "I see." Victoria's tone suggested that Sarah's lack of what she considered essential feminine accomplishments was a serious deficit. "And what skills do you possess?" The question came with barely concealed condescension. Sarah straightened her shoulders, refusing to be ashamed of her practical abilities. "I can cook and preserve food for winter. I can tend livestock, manage a household budget, mend clothes and linens. I can nurse the sick and assist with childbirth. I know which plants can heal and which can harm." The silence that followed was telling. These were all valuable skills, essential for survival in the world Sarah came from, but they clearly held little value in Victoria's estimation. "How rustic," Victoria said finally, making the word sound like an insult. "How practical," Daniel corrected firmly. "Those are skills that built this territory, that created the foundation for the wealth that allows us to sit in this dining room tonight." Benjamin leaned forward, his expression thoughtful but calculating. "Surely, cousin, you don't intend for Sarah to remain rustic. If she's to take her place in our family, she'll need proper education, proper training in the social graces expected of a Harrison." "Sarah will receive whatever education she desires," Daniel said, "but I hope she won't lose the valuable knowledge she's already gained. Too many people in our social circle have no understanding of how life's basic necessities are actually produced." Sarah listened to them discuss her future as if she weren't sitting right there, and felt a familiar flash of the independence that had carried her through the auction. "If I might interrupt," she said politely but firmly, "I believe I should have some say in my own education and future." All eyes turned to her, and she realized she'd committed some sort of social error by speaking when the adults were discussing her. But she pressed on anyway. "I appreciate the opportunities you're offering, Mr. Harrison, but I need to understand what accepting them would cost me, and what would be expected of me in return." Victoria looked scandalized by Sarah's directness, but Daniel nodded approvingly. "What would you like to know? If I stay here, if I accept your name and your support, what happens to Robert? He raised me, sacrificed for me, loved me as his own daughter. I won't abandon him for the sake of social advancement." The question hung in the air like a challenge. Sarah watched Daniel's face carefully, knowing that his answer would determine everything that came next. The future she'd never imagined possible stretched before her, glittering with promise and fraught with complications she was only beginning to understand. The morning sun cast long shadows through the estate's rose garden as Sarah walked the gravelled paths, her mind churning with thoughts that refused to settle. A week had passed since the dinner that ended so tensely, a week of careful conversations and watchful eyes as the Harrison household adjusted to her presence. Daniel had been nothing but kind, patient in answering her questions about his world, while never pressuring her to commit to staying. But Sarah could feel the undercurrents of resentment and calculation flowing around her like invisible rivers. She paused beside a marble fountain where water cascaded over carved cherubs, their innocent faces a stark contrast to the machinations she sensed brewing within the mansion's walls. The sound of approaching footsteps on gravel made her turn to find Benjamin Harrison strolling toward her, impeccably dressed, despite the early hour, and wearing that same charming smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Good morning, Sarah," he said with practiced warmth. "I was hoping to find you here. The gardens are at their finest this time of year." "They're beautiful," Sarah replied carefully, though something in his manner made her want to maintain distance. Over the past week, she'd noticed how the servants seemed to make themselves scarce whenever Benjamin was around, and Emma had let slip comments about his particular interests in the household staff. "I thought you might enjoy hearing some of the family history," Benjamin continued, gesturing toward a secluded gazebo surrounded by climbing roses. "There are fascinating stories about our ancestors that I think you'd find enlightening." Sarah glanced back toward the house, where she could see Robert through a window, sharing morning coffee with Daniel in the breakfast room. The two men had formed an unlikely friendship over the past week, bonded by their mutual devotion to her welfare. "That's very thoughtful," she said, "but I was planning to join my father and Robert for breakfast." "Oh, those tedious business discussions will continue for hours," Benjamin said dismissively. Daniel's been showing Robert the estate's financial records, something about ensuring your guardian understands the scope of what you'd be inheriting. Dreadfully boring for anyone without a head for numbers. There was something in his tone that suggested this wasn't really a request, and Sarah found herself nodding despite her reservations. All right, but just for a few minutes. The gazebo offered privacy from the main house, screened by carefully cultivated hedges that muffled sound and blocked sightlines. Benjamin gestured for her to sit on one of the ornate benches, then settled beside her closer than was entirely proper. "You know," he began, his voice taking on a more serious tone, "there are aspects of your situation that you should understand before you make any permanent decisions about your future." Sarah's pulse quickened. "What kind of aspects?" Benjamin pulled a leather portfolio from inside his jacket, the same practiced gesture she'd seen lawyers use when producing important documents. "Information that might help you make informed choices about accepting Daniel's generous offer." He opened the portfolio and extracted a sheet of official-looking paper. "This, for instance, is a copy of your birth certificate from the Territorial Records Office in Helena." Sarah took the document with trembling hands. It was indeed her birth certificate, but seeing it written out in official language made something that had always seemed abstract suddenly concrete and troubling. Sarah. "Catherine Mitchell," she read aloud, "born April 23, 1871, in Cedar Falls, Montana Territory. Father listed as..." Her voice trailed off as she read the entry. "Father listed as Robert Mitchell." The words hit her like a physical blow. "But this can't be right. Robert isn't my biological father." "Legally speaking," Benjamin said gently, "he is. When your mother married Robert Mitchell, he legally adopted you as his daughter. Your original birth record was sealed, and this new certificate was issued." Sarah stared at the document, her mind reeling. "But Daniel acknowledged me. Publicly, he claimed me as his daughter." "Daniel can acknowledge you all he likes," Benjamin explained, his voice patient but relentless. "But that doesn't change the legal reality. Legally speaking, you are Sarah Mitchell, not Sarah Harrison. You have no automatic claim to the Harrison, nay more inheritance." The implications crashed over Sarah like a cold wave. Everything she'd begun to believe about her rightful place in this family. All the dreams she'd started to nurture about education and opportunity. It could all be swept away by the technicalities of territorial law. "There's more," Benjamin continued, producing another document. "This is a record of your mother's marriage to Robert. Notice the date." Sarah looked at the marriage certificate, doing quick arithmetic in her head. Mary had married Robert when Sarah was barely 6 months old, meaning she'd spent the first half year of Sarah's life as an unmarried mother with an infant daughter to support. She was completely alone, Sarah whispered, imagining her mother's struggle during those early months. "Completely alone," Benjamin confirmed. "No family support, no income beyond what she could earn taking in washing and mending. It must have been desperately difficult." Sarah felt tears threatening as she envisioned her mother's desperation during those dark months. The Mary, she remembered, had always seemed strong and capable, but she'd never spoken of the hardship she'd endured as a single mother in an unforgiving frontier territory. "Why are you showing me this?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew. Benjamin leaned closer, his expression earnest. "Because I want you to understand the full situation before you make any decisions that could prove unfortunate. Daniel is a good man, but he's also an idealist. He sees what he wants to see, believes what he wants to believe. The practical realities of your situation are more complex than he's willing to admit." "What practical realities?" Benjamin produced a third document bearing an official seal. "This is Daniel's current will, filed with his attorney just last month. As you can see, the bulk of his estate is divided between various charitable organizations and family members. with the largest single bequest going to me as his closest male relative. Sarah scanned the legal language, picking out the key information. Benjamin was right. He stood to inherit a substantial portion of Daniel's wealth, including controlling interest in the mining operations that generated the family's fortune. Now, Benjamin continued, Daniel could certainly change his will to include you, but doing so would create complications, legal challenges from other family members, questions about your legitimacy, potential lawsuits that could tie up the estate for years. It would be messy and expensive, and there's no guarantee the courts would honor his wishes. Sarah set the documents aside, feeling overwhelmed by legal complexities she'd never considered. What are you suggesting? Benjamin's expression grew more serious, more calculating. I'm suggesting that there might be a more elegant solution to everyone's problems, one that would secure your future without creating unnecessary conflicts or complications. Sarah waited, though she was beginning to dread whatever proposal he was building toward. Marry me. The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Sarah stared at Benjamin, certain she'd misheard him. I beg your pardon? Think about it logically, Benjamin continued, his tone becoming more persuasive. As my wife, you'd have everything. You could want social position, financial security, a place in the family that no one could question. You'd be a Harrison by marriage, which is actually more secure than being one by questionable birth. Sarah stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the gazebo. You're asking me to marry you. We barely know each other. Marriages based on practical considerations often work out better than those based on romantic fantasies, Benjamin said, rising to follow her. We're compatible, we're both intelligent, and we both understand what we'd be gaining from the arrangement. And what exactly would you be gaining? Sarah asked, though she thought she could guess. Benjamin smiled, and for the first time she saw something calculating behind his charm. I'd be gaining a beautiful wife and the satisfaction of solving a delicate family problem. Plus, of course, there would be no question about my inheritance if you were my wife, rather than Daniel's potential heir. There it was, the real reason. Behind his sudden interest in her welfare, the careful presentation of legal documents, the tour of the garden, the revelation of complications. Benjamin saw her as a threat to his financial future and was trying to neutralize that threat by bringing her under his control. You're afraid I'm going to take your inheritance, Sarah said bluntly. I'm being practical about protecting interests that have been in my family for decades, Benjamin corrected. But I'm also offering you something valuable in return. Marriage, to me, would give you instant respectability, wealth, and position. The alternative is years of legal battles and social ostracism as you try to prove a legitimacy that may not even exist. Sarah felt a familiar fire rising in her chest, the same stubborn independence that had carried her through the auction and the difficult week that followed. And if I refuse your generous offer? Benjamin's expression hardened slightly. Then you'll discover just how difficult life can be for a young woman with questionable parentage and no legal protections. Society can be very cruel to those who don't fit into accepted categories. Is that a threat? It's a reality. I'm simply trying to spare you from learning it the hard way. Sarah looked at this man who was ostensibly her cousin, who shared her blood but seemed to view her primarily as a problem to be managed. The contrast with Daniel's genuine affection and Robert's unconditional love was stark and unsettling. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course, but don't take too long. Opportunities like this don't remain available indefinitely. They walked back to the house in silence, Sarah's mind churning with the implications of everything. Benjamin had revealed the legal questions about her status were real and troubling, but his proposed solution felt like trading one form of captivity for another. As they reached the main entrance, they encountered Daniel emerging from his study, his face lighting. up when he saw Sarah. "There you are," he said warmly. "I was hoping we could spend some time together this morning. There are things I want to show you, papers and photographs that belong to your mother." Sarah glanced at Benjamin, who was watching their interaction with unreadable eyes. "I'd like that very much," she said. "Excellent. Benjamin, thank you for entertaining Sarah. I hope you found the garden tour educational." "Very educational," Benjamin replied smoothly. "Sarah and I had quite an enlightening conversation about family history and future possibilities. Something in his tone made Daniel look more closely at both of them. But before he could ask questions, Victoria Harrison appeared in the doorway, her face set in lines of barely controlled frustration. "Daniel, we need to talk," she said without preamble. "Privately." Daniel sighed, recognizing the tone that meant his aunt had worked herself into a state about something. "Of course. Sarah, could you wait for me in the library? I'll join you shortly." As Sarah headed toward the library, she heard the beginning of what promised to be a heated conversation. Victoria's voice, sharp with indignation. "This situation is becoming untenable." Benjamin's smoother interjections. "Perhaps if we approach the matter differently." And through it all, Daniel's firm but weary responses. "My decision to make." The library was a sanctuary of leather-bound books and polished wood that smelled of old paper and lemon oil. Sarah tried to focus on selecting something to read, but the voices from the study carried through the heavy wooden doors. She couldn't make out specific words, but the tone was unmistakably argumentative. After 20 minutes, the study door opened and Victoria emerged, her face flushed with anger. She stalked past the library without acknowledging Sarah's presence, her silk skirts rustling with indignation. Benjamin followed a moment later, pausing in the library doorway. "Think carefully about our conversation, Sarah," he said quietly. "Some opportunities don't come twice." Finally, Daniel appeared, looking older and more tired than Sarah had seen him since their reunion. He closed the library door behind him and leaned against it for a moment, as if gathering his strength. "Is everything all right?" Sarah asked, though clearly it wasn't. Daniel straightened and attempted a smile. "Family disagreements, nothing that concerns you directly." But Sarah was beginning to understand that in a family like this, everything concerned everyone else, whether directly or indirectly. The web of relationships, expectations, and financial interests was too complex for any issue to remain truly isolated. "Benjamin showed me some documents today," she said carefully. "About my legal status, about inheritance laws." Daniel's expression grew very still. "What kind of documents?" Sarah described the morning's conversation, watching Daniel's face grow progressively darker as she spoke. By the time she finished, his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "That's presumptuous." Daniel stopped himself, taking a deep breath. "Sarah, I want you to understand something very clearly. Your legal status is not in question. I am your father, I acknowledge you as my daughter, and I will ensure that you receive everything that rightfully belongs to you. But the birth certificate lists Robert as my father. Birth certificates can be amended, legal documents can be corrected. I have lawyers who specialize in exactly these kinds of situations." Daniel's voice carried absolute conviction. "Benjamin is trying to frighten you into making decisions that would benefit him, not you." Sarah felt relief wash over her, but questions remained. Why would he do that? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, staring out the library windows at the grounds where she'd walked with Benjamin just hours before. "Because he's been raised to believe that wealth and position are the most important things in life, and your presence here threatens both for him. He sees you as competition rather than family." And Victoria, does she feel the same way? Victoria is concerned about social propriety and family reputation. She believes that acknowledging you publicly will create scandals that will reflect poorly on all of us. Daniel turned back to face her. She's wrong, but her fears aren't entirely unreasonable given the society we live in. Sarah absorbed this information, beginning to understand the complex dynamics she'd stumbled into. What did they want you to do in the meeting just now? Daniel's jaw tightened. They wanted me to provide you with a generous settlement and arrange for you to live quietly somewhere far from here. Essentially, to pay you to disappear and never claim the Harrison name publicly. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. And what did you tell them? Daniel stepped closer, his eyes intense with emotion. I told them that you are my daughter, that you belong here as much as anyone, and that I will not hide you away like some shameful secret. You have every right to the Harrison name, to a place in this family, and to a share in everything I've built. Emma appeared in the doorway, carrying a silver tea service. Excuse me, Mr. Harrison, but Mrs. Victoria asked me to inform you that she's invited guests for dinner tonight. The Ashworth family from Helena and Judge Bradley from the Territorial Court. Daniel's expression grew grim. How many guests? 12, sir. She said it would be a good opportunity to introduce Miss Sarah to proper society. After Emma left, Sarah turned to Daniel with growing unease. This dinner, it's not really about introducing me to society, is it? No, Daniel said quietly. It's about putting you on display, subjecting you to scrutiny and judgment from people whose opinions Victoria values. She's hoping you'll embarrass yourself, prove that you don't belong in their world. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine, despite the warm morning air streaming through the library windows. What kind of people are they? Judge Bradley is one of the Territorial Court's most conservative jurists, a man who believes very strongly in traditional social hierarchies. The Ashworths are old mining money from Helena. They've spent decades climbing the social ladder and are very protective of their position, and they'll be judging whether I'm worthy of the Harrison name. They'll be looking for any excuse to find you wanting, Daniel confirmed. Your accent, your manners, your knowledge of social conventions, everything will be evaluated and found. Lacking if Victoria has her way, Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the peaceful gardens where peacocks strutted across manicured lawns. The contrast between the serenity outside and the brewing storm within the house felt almost surreal. What happens if I fail their test? Daniel joined her at the window, his reflection stern in the glass. You don't fail or pass based on their opinions. You're my daughter, and that's not subject to a vote or social approval, but it could make life here very difficult. It could, Daniel admitted, but it could also establish your place so firmly that future challenges become impossible. Sarah turned to face him, seeing something she hadn't noticed before, a steely determination that reminded her of her own stubborn streak. You want me to go through with this dinner? I want you to do whatever feels right to you. But if you choose to face them, I'll be beside you every step of the way. As Sarah considered the challenge ahead, she thought about her mother's courage in leaving everything familiar to protect the people she loved. She thought about Robert's quiet strength in raising a daughter who wasn't his blood. And she thought about the woman she wanted to become, someone who faced her fears rather than running from them. All right, she said quietly, let's show them exactly who Sarah Harrison is. Daniel's face broke into the first genuinely joyful smile she'd seen from him since their reunion. Are you certain? Sarah nodded, feeling a sense of rightness settle over her like a comfortable cloak. I'm certain, but I have one condition. Name it. Robert sits beside me at dinner. Whatever happens, wherever this leads, he remains part of my family. Daniel reached over and took her hand, his eyes bright with pride and affection. Sarah, those parts of yourself that Robert helped create are exactly what make you worth fighting for. I wouldn't change a thing about who you are. As they stood together in the library, surrounded by thousands of books representing knowledge and opportunity Sarah had never dreamed of accessing, she felt something shift inside her. For the first time since the auction, she wasn't thinking about what she was losing or what she was being forced to choose between. Instead, she was thinking about what she was gaining and what she was going to do with the extraordinary second chance she'd been given. The battle lines were drawn. Tonight, she would claim her place in the Harrison family, or she would discover just how far some people would go to deny her that birthright. Either way, Sarah Harrison was ready for the fight. The emerald silk gown shimmered in the candlelight. As Sarah descended the grand staircase, her hand resting lightly on the polished banister. The dress, hastily ordered from Helena's finest dressmaker and altered throughout the afternoon, transformed her from a frontier girl into something that could belong in the drawing rooms of territorial high society. The Harrison family emeralds, a necklace that had graced the throats of 3 generations of women, caught the light from the crystal chandelier above, sending sparkles across the foyer like scattered stars. But it wasn't the jewelry or the gown that commanded attention as Sarah entered the drawing room, where 12 of Montana Territory's most influential citizens waited. It was the quiet dignity she carried herself with, the way she moved with unconscious grace, despite the foreign elegance of her surroundings. Victoria Harrison, resplendent in midnight blue silk, watched from across the room with the calculating gaze of a general surveying a battlefield. "Ladies and gentlemen," Victoria announced, her voice carrying the practiced authority of someone accustomed to commanding social situations, "may I present Miss Sarah Harrison, Daniel's daughter." The slight pause before daughter was deliberate, Sarah realized, as was the careful emphasis on Miss rather than addressing her with any family title. Victoria was already planting seeds of doubt about Sarah's legitimacy in the minds of her carefully chosen guests. Judge Theodore Bradley, a stern man with silver whiskers and the bearing of someone who'd spent decades pronouncing judgment on others, stepped forward first. His pale blue eyes studied Sarah with the intensity of someone evaluating evidence in a courtroom. "Miss Harrison," he said formally, his voice carrying the weight of territorial authority, "I understand you've recently joined the family under unusual circumstances." "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "I've recently learned that Daniel Harrison is my biological father. It's been quite an adjustment for all of us." "Indeed," Bradley's tone suggested he found the entire situation highly irregular. "And where did you receive your education, Miss Harrison?" The question felt like a trap. But Sarah had spent the afternoon preparing for exactly this kind of interrogation. "In Cedar Falls, Your Honor. Mr. Robert Mitchell, who raised me, ensured I received instruction in reading, writing, arithmetic, and the sciences. I've also studied literature and history through the books available in our local area." "How comprehensive," interjected Mrs. Cordelia Ashworth, a woman whose elaborate coiffure and jewels proclaimed her wealth as loudly as any herald. "And what languages do you speak besides English?" Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks, but refused to show embarrassment. "Only English, Mrs. Ashworth. I've had some exposure to Latin through biblical studies, but I wouldn't claim fluency." "No. French, German, Spanish?" Mrs. Ashworth's eyebrows rose in exaggerated surprise. "How unusual for a young lady of supposed good breeding." "Perhaps," said a new voice from near the fireplace, "we might consider that Miss Harrison has had educational opportunities appropriate to her circumstances, which have differed significantly from those typically available to territorial society." Sarah turned to see who had spoken in her defense and found herself looking at a man perhaps 50 years old, with intelligent eyes and prematurely grey hair. His evening dress was impeccable but understated, suggesting wealth worn with comfort rather than ostentation. "Allow me to introduce Dr. Marcus Webb," Victoria said with barely concealed irritation at the interruption. "Dr. Webb recently arrived from Boston to establish a medical practice in Helena." Dr. Webb stepped forward with a slight bow. "Miss Harrison, I'm pleased to make your acquaintance. I understand you've assisted with medical emergencies in your community." "Yes, sir," Sarah replied, grateful for a question that played to her strengths rather than her deficiencies. "I've helped Dr. Patterson in Cedar Falls with various cases, setting bones, treating fevers, assisting with difficult births." "Fascinating," Dr. Webb said, his interest clearly genuine. "And have you observed any particular patterns in frontier medicine, remedies or practices that might be overlooked by formal medical training?" Sarah found herself relaxing slightly as she described her experiences with herbal treatments, the challenges of providing medical care in isolated communities, and the practical innovations that frontier necessity had taught her. Dr. Webb listened, with the attention of someone who recognized valuable knowledge regardless of its source, but Judge Bradley seemed less impressed by this turn in the conversation. "While Miss Harrison's practical skills may be admirable in their context," he said with the tone of someone steering discussion back to proper channels, "surely the question before us is whether she possesses the refinements necessary for her claimed position in territorial society." "And what refinements would those be, Judge Bradley?" Daniel asked, his voice carrying a warning edge that made several guests glance nervously between him and the jurist. "The accomplishments expected of a lady of good breeding," Bradley replied, stiffly. "Musical training, artistic abilities, familiarity with literature and philosophy, conversational skills in modern languages, the cultural foundations that distinguish civilization from mere frontier existence." The insult was barely veiled, and Sarah felt anger flash through her like lightning. But before she could respond, Robert Mitchell spoke from his position near the windows where he'd been quietly observing the proceedings. "Begging your pardon, Judge," Robert said in his calm, measured way, "but it seems to me that refinement might include treating a young lady with courtesy regardless of her background. Where I come from, that's considered the mark of true breeding." The rebuke, delivered in Robert's unassuming manner, struck the room like a thunderclap. Several guests looked scandalized that a man of Robert's obvious working-class origins would dare correct a territorial judge. But Sarah saw approving nods from Dr. Webb and at least two other guests. Judge Bradley's face flushed red above his. "White collar, I hardly think a ranch hand is qualified to lecture on matters of social propriety. Robert Mitchell," Daniel said firmly, "is the man who raised my daughter with love, wisdom, and moral guidance that any father would be proud to claim. His opinions on her character carry more weight with me than the social prejudices of people who've known her for less than an hour." The tension in the drawing room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Victoria's carefully orchestrated evening was spiraling away from her control, and Sarah could see the calculation behind her eyes as she searched for a way to regain the initiative. "Perhaps," Mrs. Ashworth suggested, with the smooth diplomacy of someone experienced in navigating social minefields, "we might adjourn to the dining room? I understand Cook has prepared something special for this evening." The dining room had been transformed into a showcase of Harrison wealth and taste. Crystal glasses caught the light from silver candelabras, and the table settings included more pieces of silverware than Sarah had ever seen in one place. She found herself seated between Dr. Webb and a young man, introduced as Thomas Ashworth, Mrs. Ashworth's son, who had been studying law in Chicago and recently returned to establish a practice in Helena. The conversation during the first courses remained carefully neutral, discussion of territorial politics, the weather, the prospects for statehood. But Sarah could sense the undercurrents of evaluation and judgment flowing beneath the polite exchanges. "Miss Harrison," Thomas Ashworth said during the fish course, his tone friendly but carrying an undertone of challenge, "I understand you've Had some experience with bookkeeping and household management. Yes, Mr. Ashworth. I've helped manage the household accounts and assisted with various business transactions. How interesting. And what's your opinion on the question of women's suffrage? Should ladies have the vote? The question was clearly designed to expose Sarah as either a dangerous radical or a disappointingly conventional thinker. She could feel the table's attention focusing on her as she considered her response. I believe, Sarah said carefully, that anyone who bears the responsibilities of citizenship, who pays taxes, follows laws, and contributes to their community's welfare, should have a voice in choosing the people who make those laws and set those taxes. If that makes me a radical, then I suppose I am one. The response drew surprised looks from several guests and a barely suppressed smile from Dr. Webb. Even Judge Bradley seemed taken aback by the thoughtfulness of her answer. But surely, Mrs. Ashworth said, with the tone of someone delivering a social correction, you don't mean to suggest that women should abandon their proper sphere of influence for the rough world of politics? I don't see why having opinions about governance means abandoning domestic responsibilities, Sarah replied. Women manage households, educate children, and make decisions that affect their family's welfare every day. Those same skills seem quite relevant to evaluating candidates and policies. Benjamin Harrison, who had been quietly observing the exchange, chose this moment to join the conversation. You raise interesting points, cousin, but I wonder if you've considered the practical implications of such ideas. Women's suffrage movements often attract unsavory elements, radicals who seek to overthrow traditional social structures entirely. Sarah recognized the trap Benjamin was setting. By associating her views with dangerous radicalism, he was trying to make her appear unfit for polite society. I think, she said evenly, that wanting a voice in decisions that affect one's life is quite different from wanting to overthrow society. Most of the women I know are far too practical to waste time on revolution when they're busy building communities and raising the next generation. Dr. Webb chuckled appreciatively. Well said, Miss Harrison. In my experience, the women who've built this territory have shown considerably more sense than many of the men who claim to govern it. The comment drew nervous laughter from some guests and disapproving looks from others. Sarah was beginning to understand that Dr. Webb's presence at this dinner hadn't been part of Victoria's plan. He was proving to be an unexpected ally rather than another judge of her worthiness. As the evening progressed through multiple courses, the conversation ranged across topics designed to test Sarah's knowledge and expose her limitations. Literature, philosophy, current events, social customs, each subject was approached like an examination. She might fail. But something unexpected was happening. Instead of being intimidated into silence, Sarah found herself engaging more confidently with each exchange. When Mrs. Ashworth questioned her familiarity with modern poetry, Sarah quoted passages from Walt Whitman that surprised the table with their passionate eloquence. When Judge Bradley challenged her understanding of territorial law, she responded with insights drawn from her practical experience with property disputes and contract negotiations that impressed even him. Most surprisingly, she found herself enjoying parts of the evening. Dr. Webb proved to be a fascinating conversationalist, sharing stories from his medical training in Boston and his observations about frontier health challenges. Thomas Ashworth, despite his initial testing questions, seemed genuinely interested in her perspectives on territorial development and women's roles in building frontier communities. But it was during the final course that Victoria Harrison played her most dangerous card. Sarah, dear, she said with the sweetness of poisoned honey, I've been wondering about your mother's family. The Brennans, wasn't it? I believe there were some difficulties in their background? The question hit the table like a bombshell. Sarah felt every conversation halt as guests turned their attention to what promised to be the evening's most dramatic revelation. "My mother's family were Irish immigrants," Sarah said carefully, unsure where Victoria was heading, but sensing, "Oh, danger, yes, of course," Victoria continued with false sympathy, "but I'm referring to the more recent troubles, the circumstances surrounding your mother's first marriage, perhaps." Sarah's blood ran cold as she realized what Victoria was about to reveal. Somehow, Daniel's aunt had discovered the truth about Mary's marriage to the abusive Thomas Sullivan, about his suspicious death, about the shadows that had haunted her mother's past. "I'm not sure what you mean," Sarah said, but her voice carried less conviction than she'd hoped. Victoria smiled with the expression of someone delivering a killing blow. "I mean the unfortunate incident involving Thomas Sullivan's death. The questions that were raised about the circumstances, the reason your mother found it necessary to flee Colorado Territory so suddenly." The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah could feel the weight of 12 pairs of eyes studying her reaction, measuring her response to this devastating revelation. She understood now why Victoria had orchestrated this dinner, why she'd chosen these particular guests. It wasn't just to test Sarah's social skills. It was to destroy her reputation so completely that claiming the Harrison name would become impossible. In that moment of crisis, Sarah made a choice that would define the rest of her life. Instead of denying Victoria's implications or trying to minimize the scandal, she lifted her chin with the same stubborn dignity her mother had shown in facing impossible circumstances. "Thomas Sullivan," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the dining room, "was a violent drunk who abused my mother for 2 years before she found the courage to leave him. When he discovered she was carrying another man's child, he threatened to claim me and demand money from my father's family in exchange for his silence." The table remained frozen in shocked silence as Sarah continued. "He died in a drunken fall into a river 3 days after making those threats. My mother had nothing to do with his death, but she understood that questions would be raised, that suspicious minds would connect his threats to his accident. So she took me and disappeared, sacrificing her own happiness to protect both me and my father from scandal." Sarah paused, meeting the eyes of each guest in turn. "My mother was guilty of nothing more than trying to escape an impossible situation and find happiness with a man who truly loved her. She was brave and strong, and she made sacrifices to protect her family from exactly this kind of judgment." Judge Bradley leaned forward, his expression intense. "You're suggesting that your mother fled to avoid suspicion in a man's death?" "I'm stating that my mother fled to protect the people she loved from being associated with something she had no part in," Sarah corrected. "The difference matters, Your Honor." Dr. Webb set down his wineglass with deliberate care. "Miss Harrison, it takes considerable courage to speak such truths in circumstances like these. Your mother's situation sounds remarkably similar to cases I've encountered in my practice. Women trapped in abusive marriages with few legal protections and fewer options for escape. The law provides remedies for such situations," Judge Bradley said stiffly. "Does it?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying a challenge that surprised everyone, including herself. What remedies existed in 1870 for a 19-year-old woman married to a violent drunk? Divorce was nearly impossible, separation meant destitution, and a woman had no legal right to her own earnings or even her own children. The questions hung in the air like accusations, forcing the assembled guests to confront the harsh realities that polite society preferred to ignore. "My mother chose love over security," Sarah continued. "And when that choice threatened the people she cared about, she chose their welfare over her own happiness. I'm proud to be her daughter, and I won't apologize for her courage or her sacrifices." The silence stretched until Dr. Webb began to applaud slowly, deliberately. "Beautifully said, Miss Harrison. Your mother raised a daughter worthy of her example." One by one, other guests joined the applause. First Thomas Ashworth, then an elderly woman Sarah hadn't spoken with during dinner, then even Judge Bradley, though his clapping was restrained and thoughtful. Victoria's face had gone pale with fury, as her carefully planned ambush backfired spectacularly. Instead of destroying Sarah's reputation, she had inadvertently provided a platform for Sarah to demonstrate exactly the kind of grace under pressure that frontier society valued most. Daniel stood at the head of the table, his eyes bright with pride and moisture. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've witnessed tonight why I'm so proud to claim Sarah as my daughter. She faces adversity with courage, speaks truth with conviction, and honors her mother's memory with dignity." As the evening wound down and guests began making their departures, Sarah found herself receiving expressions of respect and even admiration from people who had arrived, prepared to find her wanting. Dr. Webb lingered to discuss the possibility of medical training opportunities. Thomas Ashworth expressed interest in corresponding legal reforms. Even Judge Bradley approached with grudging respect. "Miss Harrison," he said formally, "you've shown tonight that breeding is about character rather than circumstance. The territory could use more citizens with your combination of principle and practical wisdom." But it was Victoria's parting comment, delivered as she bid farewell to the last guests, that crystallized the evening's significance. "Well played, my dear," she said to Sarah with cold admiration. "I underestimated you. That won't happen again." The words carried the weight of acknowledgement and warning. Sarah had passed the test, claimed her place in territorial society, and proven her worthiness of the Harrison name. But she had also made an enemy of a woman with the wealth and connections to make life very difficult for those who crossed her. As Sarah changed out of her silk gown later that evening, she reflected on the transformation that had occurred. She had entered the dining room as Sarah Mitchell, the auctioned daughter of a failed rancher. She was leaving it as Sarah Harrison, acknowledged heiress to one of Montana's greatest fortunes and a young woman capable of holding her own among the territory's elite. The battle was won. But as Victoria's words echoed, in her mind, Sarah understood that the war for her place in this family was just beginning. Standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit mountains that stretched beyond the estate's borders, Sarah Harrison felt ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. She had found her family, discovered her heritage, and claimed her birthright. Now it was time to decide what she would build with the extraordinary second chance she'd been given. The morning after the dinner party dawned grey and threatening, with storm clouds gathering over the Montana peaks like harbingers of conflict to come. Sarah stood at her bedroom window watching the play of light and shadow across the mountains, her mind still processing the events of the previous evening. She had won a significant victory, but Victoria's parting words echoed with ominous promise. That won't happen again. A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. Emma entered with the usual tea service, but her face carried an expression of barely contained excitement. "Miss Sarah," she whispered, glancing toward the door to ensure privacy, "you should. No, there's been a visitor this morning, a lawyer from Helena, asking questions about you and your family." Sarah's stomach tightened. "What kind of questions?" "About your birth certificate, your mother's marriages, legal documents." He spoke with Mrs. Victoria for near an hour in the study. Emma set down the tea tray with trembling hands. "The whole household's talking about it. There's something brewing, miss, and it doesn't feel good." Before Sarah could respond, footsteps in the corridor announced another arrival. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his face grim with determination and something that looked like barely controlled anger. "Sarah, we need to talk immediately. Bring Robert. This concerns him as well." They gathered in Daniel's private study. a room lined with ledgers and mining maps that spoke of the vast business empire he'd built. Robert sat quietly in a leather chair, his weathered hands folded in his lap, while Sarah positioned herself near the window where she could watch for any sign of additional visitors. "Benjamin and Victoria have made their move," Daniel began without preamble. "They've retained a lawyer named Jeremiah Walsh, a man with a reputation for taking cases that other attorneys won't touch. He's filed papers with the territorial court, challenging your legal status and my right to acknowledge you as my heir." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "On what grounds?" Daniel pulled a legal document from his desk drawer, his jaw tight with suppressed fury. "They're claiming that I've been deceived about your parentage, that your mother had relationships with multiple men during the period when you were conceived, and that I have no proof you're actually my biological child." The words hit Sarah like physical blows. "But that's ridiculous. You knew my mother. You were with her." "I know that. And you know that," Daniel interrupted. "But the law requires proof, not just belief. They're demanding a formal hearing where I'll have to present evidence of paternity that goes beyond my simple acknowledgement." Robert cleared his throat quietly. "What kind of evidence?" "Testimony from witnesses who can attest to my relationship with Mary during the relevant time period. Documentary evidence of our connection. Physical evidence that you're my child, rather than—" Daniel hesitated, clearly reluctant to voice the cruel implications. "Rather than the child of Thomas Sullivan or some other man," Sarah finished, her voice steady despite the turmoil in her chest. "They're trying to make me prove I deserve the name I've claimed." "It's worse than that," Daniel continued. "Walsh has also filed an injunction preventing me from changing my will or transferring any property to you until the paternity question is resolved. They're trying to freeze your inheritance while they destroy your legitimacy." Sarah stood and began pacing the length of the study, her mind racing through the implications. How long could this process take? Months, possibly years. The territorial court system moves slowly, and Walsh is skilled at finding procedural delays and legal complications. Meanwhile, Benjamin would continue managing my business interests, Victoria would remain in control of the household, and you'd be left in legal limbo. The cunning of the plan was breathtaking. Unable to defeat Sarah through social pressure or marriage proposals, Benjamin and Victoria had turned to the law itself as a weapon. They were betting that a prolonged legal battle would either drive Sarah away or exhaust Daniel's patience and resources. "There's something else," Daniel said, his voice growing darker. "Walsh has hired investigators to examine your mother's past in Colorado. They're looking for any evidence that might cast doubt on her character or my paternity claims." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. "They want to dig up Thomas Sullivan's death again, make it part of the legal record." "Almost certainly. They'll argue that Mary's flight from Colorado demonstrates consciousness of guilt, that her secretive behavior proves she was hiding the true identity of your father." Robert had been listening to this exchange with growing agitation. Now he stood, his usually calm demeanor replaced by righteous anger. "This is wrong," he said simply. "That girl is your daughter. Anyone with eyes can see it. The way she moves, the way she thinks, the stubborn set of her jaw when she's determined about something. She's got your blood running through her veins." "I know that," Daniel replied. "But proving it in court is another matter entirely. Most of the people who could testify to my relationship with Mary are dead or scattered across half the continent. The boarding house where we met burned down 5 years ago, taking any records with it." Sarah stopped pacing and turned to face the two men who'd shaped her life. "What are my options?" "You could walk away," Daniel said quietly. "Accept a generous settlement and start a new life somewhere far from here." Walsh hinted that Benjamin would be willing to provide substantial compensation in exchange for your agreement not to pursue any claims against the Harrison estate. Essentially, they'd buy my silence and my absence. Yes, it would be enough money to ensure your comfort for life, to pay for the finest education, to allow you to marry for love rather than financial necessity. Sarah considered this possibility. She could take the money, perhaps travel east. For university education, build a life free from the complications and conflicts that surrounded the Harrison name. It would be the practical choice, the safe choice, and if I refuse, then we fight, Daniel said with quiet intensity. We gather whatever evidence we can find, we bring in the best lawyers money can hire, and we prove in court that you're my daughter and rightful heir. What would that cost? Daniel's smile was grim. Everything, potentially. Walsh isn't just challenging your legitimacy. He's questioning my judgment, my business acumen, my fitness to manage the Harrison interests. A prolonged legal battle could damage the family's reputation, affect our business relationships, and cost us allies we'll need for other fights. Sarah walked to the window, looking out at the estate that had briefly felt like home. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was being forced to choose between security and family, just as her mother had been 19 years earlier. There's a third option, she said slowly, an idea forming as she spoke. Both men looked at her expectantly. We gather the evidence we need, but we don't wait for them to control the timing and the battleground. We take this fight public, make our case in the court of public opinion before they can drag us through years of legal proceedings. Daniel frowned. What do you mean? Sarah turned back to them, her expression animated with growing conviction. Benjamin and Victoria are counting on being able to control the narrative, to present this as a question of legal technicalities and family propriety. But what if we make it about something larger? About justice, about families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control, about the rights of women and children to claim their rightful place in the world. You want to turn this into a cause, Robert said, understanding dawning in his voice. Exactly. Dr. Webb mentioned last night that he's involved with territorial reform movements. Thomas Ashworth expressed interest in legal reforms affecting women's rights. Judge Bradley, for all his conservatism, seemed impressed by arguments about justice and fairness. Daniel was listening intently now, his business mind clearly evaluating the strategy. You're talking about building a coalition of supporters who see your case as representative of larger issues. I'm talking about making it impossible for Benjamin and Victoria to win, even if they technically succeed in court. If we can demonstrate that their challenge is motivated by greed rather than legitimate concerns about paternity, if we can show that they're using legal technicalities to deny a young woman her rightful inheritance, then they lose regardless of what the court decides. The plan was audacious, risky, and completely at odds with the quiet, private approach that Montana's elite typically favored for family disputes. But it offered something that traditional legal strategy couldn't: the possibility of victory through moral authority rather than just legal precedent. It would mean exposing everything, Daniel warned. Your mother's past, Thomas Sullivan's death, the circumstances of your birth. There would be no privacy, no way to control how the story gets told once it's public. Sarah felt a moment of doubt, thinking about her mother's careful efforts to protect her from exactly this kind of scrutiny. But then she remembered Mary's letter, the words about building a life without shame or compromise. My mother spent 19 years hiding from the truth, she said finally. Maybe it's time to stop hiding and start fighting. A commotion in the courtyard outside interrupted their conversation. Through the window, Sarah could see a carriage bearing the territorial court's official seal pulling up to the front entrance. Several men in formal dress stepped down, led by a figure she recognized as Jeremiah Walsh from his description in Helena's newspapers. They're here, Daniel said grimly. Walsh must be planning to serve the legal papers formally, probably with witnesses present, to ensure we can't claim ignorance of the proceedings. Sarah straightened her shoulders, feeling the same determination that had carried her through the auction and the dinner party. Then let's go meet them. But this time, we control the conversation. They descended to the main foyer where Victoria and Benjamin were already waiting with expressions of barely concealed satisfaction. Walsh, a thin man with sharp features and calculating eyes, stood near the entrance with two court officials and what appeared to be a clerk, taking notes. "Mr. Harrison," Walsh said formally as Daniel appeared, "I have papers to serve regarding the legal status of the young woman claiming to be your daughter." "Miss Sarah Harrison," Daniel corrected firmly, "is my acknowledged daughter and heir. If you have business with her, you can address her directly." Walsh's eyes shifted to Sarah, studying her with the cold assessment of someone evaluating an opponent. "Miss Harrison, these documents require your presence at a hearing to determine the legitimacy of your claimed relationship to Mr. Daniel Harrison and your right to inherit from his estate." Sarah stepped forward, accepting the papers with steady hands despite the tremor she felt inside. "Mr. Walsh, I understand you represent parties who believe they have a greater claim to my father's affection and inheritance than his own daughter does." The directness of her response clearly caught Walsh off guard. He'd probably expected tears, protests, or at least some sign of intimidation. "I represent parties concerned about fraudulent claims against a respected family's estate," he corrected. "Stiffly, fraudulent claims," Sarah repeated, her voice carrying clearly through the foyer. "You're suggesting that my father, one of the territory's most successful businessmen, is somehow incapable of recognizing his own child. I'm suggesting that emotional attachments can cloud judgment, and that the law requires proof rather than sentiment when substantial inheritances are at stake." Robert stepped forward then, his quiet voice cutting through the formal legal language. "Mr. Walsh, I raised that girl from the time she was 6 months old. I've watched her grow, seen her develop, observed her in every possible circumstance. She's got Daniel Harrison's eyes, his stubborn streak, and his way of tilting her head when she's thinking through a problem. If you can't see that she's his daughter, you're either blind or being paid not to look." The observation was delivered with such matter-of-fact conviction that even Walsh seemed momentarily nonplussed. It was one thing to challenge legal documents and birth certificates. It was another to dismiss the testimony of a man who clearly had no financial interest in the outcome. "Mr. Walsh asked. "Mitchell, Robert Mitchell. I'm the man who's loved and cared for Sarah since she was an infant, regardless of whose blood runs in her veins." "Then you'll understand," Benjamin interjected smoothly, "why we need to ensure that her legal status is properly established. Surely you want what's best for Sarah, which includes certainty about her rightful place in the world." "Her rightful place," Robert replied with quiet dignity, "is with people who love her and recognize her worth. Everything else is just paperwork." Walsh was clearly growing frustrated with the direction of the conversation. "Nevertheless, the law," Sarah interrupted, "requires justice, and justice demands that my right to my father's name and inheritance be determined by truth, rather than the schemes of people who see me as an obstacle to their own enrichment." She paused, looking around at the assembled group. "Mr. Walsh, you can pursue your legal challenge, and we'll meet you in court with evidence that will prove beyond any doubt that I am Daniel Harrison's daughter. But you should understand that this case will be about more than inheritance law. It will be about whether family bonds can be dissolved by legal technicalities, whether a young woman can be denied her birthright because her mother made difficult choices to protect the people she loved." The words hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down. Sarah was making it clear that she wouldn't be intimidated into accepting a settlement or quietly disappearing from the Harrison family's life. Walsh gathered his papers with obvious irritation. "Miss Harrison, you may find that legal proceedings are less romantic and more demanding than you anticipate. The court will require substantial evidence, not just emotional appeals." "Then we'll provide substantial evidence," Daniel said firmly, "along with testimony from anyone who knew Mary Brennan and can attest to our relationship during the period when Sarah was conceived, including testimony about Thomas Sullivan's death and your mother's flight from Colorado Territory," Walsh asked with a slight smile. "Including testimony about my mother's courage in protecting her family from scandal and persecution," Sarah replied without hesitation. "If you want to make her past part of this case, we'll ensure that the full truth gets told, not just the parts that serve your client's interests." After Walsh and his entourage departed, the Harrison household was left to absorb the implications of what had just occurred. Victoria retired to her room with a headache. Benjamin disappeared to send telegrams to allies in Helena, and Daniel began making notes about potential witnesses and evidence. But Sarah found herself drawn back to the rose garden where Benjamin had made his marriage proposal just days earlier. The contrast between that attempted manipulation and the direct legal challenge they now faced struck her as symbolic of the different phases of her journey. Robert joined her among the roses, his presence as comforting as it had always been. "You scared?" he asked quietly. Sarah considered the question honestly. "Terrified," she admitted, "but also relieved somehow. At least now we know what we're fighting, and we can fight it directly instead of dancing around it." "Your mother would be proud of you," Robert said. "She always said you had more courage than sense, and that it would either be your greatest strength or your greatest weakness." "Which do you think it is?" Robert smiled, the expression transforming his weathered face. "With you, Sarah, I've learned that courage and sense aren't opposites. You find ways to be brave and smart at the same time. That's what's going to carry you through this." As they stood together in the garden, watching storm clouds gather over the mountains, Sarah felt the weight of the challenge ahead, but also a growing confidence in her ability to meet it. The auction that had brought her to this place seemed like a lifetime ago, but the lessons it had taught about dignity under pressure and the strength found in truth would serve her well in the battles to come. The legal war for her identity and inheritance was just beginning, but Sarah Harrison was ready to fight for her rightful place in the world, not just for herself, but for every woman who'd ever been told she didn't belong in the halls of power and privilege. The girl who had once faced auction as property was now prepared to claim her birthright as an equal. 6 weeks after the legal papers were served, the territorial courthouse in Helena overflowed with spectators, drawn by what newspapers across the region had dubbed the Harrison inheritance trial. Sarah stood at the courthouse steps, her dark green traveling dress crisp despite the October wind that whipped across the Montana capital. Beside her, Daniel Harrison wore the expression of a man prepared for battle, while Robert Mitchell's steady presence provided the same quiet strength that had anchored Sarah's life for 18 years. The case had indeed become the public spectacle Sarah had envisioned, but in ways none of them had fully anticipated. Her decision to share her story with sympathetic journalists had transformed a private family dispute into a symbol of larger social questions about women's rights, family legitimacy, and the power of wealth to manipulate justice. The Helena Independent had run a series of articles chronicling the auctioned heiress story, while newspapers as distant as San Francisco and Chicago had picked up the tale of the young woman fighting for her birthright. "Miss Harrison," called a reporter from the Denver Post as they climbed the courthouse steps. "Are you confident about today's proceedings?" Sarah paused, understanding that her words would be telegraphed across the country within hours. "I'm confident that truth will prevail over manipulation and that justice will recognize the bonds of family regardless of legal technicalities. Inside the packed courtroom, Territorial Judge William Morrison, a different jurist than the prejudiced Bradley who had attended Victoria's dinner party, surveyed the crowd with stern authority. The plaintiff's table held Benjamin Harrison and Victoria, flanked by attorney Jeremiah Walsh and a team of legal assistants. Their confidence was visible but seemed forced, as if they understood that public opinion had shifted against them despite their legal advantages. At the defendant's table, Sarah sat between Daniel and their attorney, Marcus Fleming, a young but brilliant lawyer from Chicago whom Dr. Webb had recommended. Fleming had built his reputation defending the rights of women and children in inheritance disputes, and his presence represented Daniel's commitment to fighting this battle with every resource at his disposal. "The case before us today," Judge Morrison announced as silence fell over the courtroom, "concerns the legal recognition of Miss Sarah Mitchell's claimed relationship to Mr. Daniel Harrison and her right to inherit from his estate. Mr. Walsh, you may present your opening argument." Walsh rose with theatrical precision, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to courtroom dominance. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about the integrity of our legal system and the protection of legitimate family interests against fraudulent claims." He paused, scanning the packed gallery as if addressing each spectator personally. The plaintiff, Miss Mitchell, appeared in Mr. Harrison's life under dramatic circumstances that appeal to the emotions but cannot substitute for legal proof. She claims to be the daughter of Daniel Harrison and one Mary Brennan, based solely on Mr. Harrison's sentimental belief in a resemblance and a romantic attachment formed 19 years ago. Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, but Fleming's gentle touch on her arm reminded her to remain composed. This was exactly the kind of characterization they had expected and prepared for. "The evidence will show," Walsh continued, "that Mary Brennan was a woman of questionable character who had relationships with multiple men during the period in question. She fled Colorado Territory under suspicious circumstances following the death of her legal husband, Thomas Sullivan, and spent years moving from place to place under assumed names, behavior consistent with someone hiding guilty secrets." The tough words stung, but Sarah had steeled herself for this assault on her mother's memory. Walsh was painting Mary as a woman whose word couldn't be trusted, whose moral character was so compromised that any claims about paternity must be viewed with suspicion. Furthermore, Walsh said, building toward his climax, Miss Mitchell was legally adopted by Robert Mitchell upon his marriage to Mary Brennan. Under territorial law, this adoption severed any previous paternal relationships and established Mr. Mitchell as her legal father. She cannot simply choose to claim a different paternity based on convenience or financial opportunity. The legal argument was sound, Sarah knew, which was why Fleming had spent weeks researching precedents and preparing counter-arguments. The question wasn't just whether she was Daniel's biological daughter, but whether the law would recognize that relationship. Given the complexities of her mother's subsequent marriage, Fleming's opening response was measured but passionate. "Your Honor, this case is indeed about the integrity of our legal system, but it's about ensuring that technicalities don't triumph over truth, and that families aren't destroyed by those who would manipulate the law for personal gain." He gestured toward Sarah with obvious respect. "Miss Harrison, and I use that name deliberately, has never denied the love and care she received from Robert Mitchell. But love and legal adoption don't erase biological reality or eliminate a daughter's right to know and be acknowledged by her natural father." Fleming moved to stand directly in front of the judge's bench. "The evidence will prove beyond any doubt that Sarah Harrison is the biological daughter of Daniel Harrison and Mary Brennan. It will show that Mary's decision to conceal this relationship was motivated not by deception, but by love, a desire to protect both her daughter and Mr. Harrison from scandal and persecution. The courtroom stirred as Fleming's voice grew stronger. We will demonstrate that the current challenge is motivated not by legitimate concerns about paternity, but by the greed of individuals who see Miss Harrison's rightful inheritance as an obstacle to their own enrichment. The first phase of testimony focused on establishing the timeline and circumstances of Daniel and Mary's relationship. Daniel took the stand with quiet dignity, recounting their courtship, their plans for marriage, and the family pressures that ultimately separated them. His testimony was detailed and convincing, painting a picture of genuine love rather than casual romance. Mr. Harrison, Fleming asked, when Mary Brennan told you she was carrying your child, what was your response? I proposed marriage immediately, Daniel replied without hesitation. I wanted nothing more than to provide for her and our child. I begged her to let me face whatever social consequences might arise. And what prevented that marriage? Daniel's expression grew pained. My family's threats to destroy Mary's livelihood and reputation if she pursued the relationship. They made it clear that associating with me would bring ruin not just to her, but to anyone who employed or aided her. Walsh's cross-examination was brutal but predictable. He attacked Daniel's certainty about paternity, questioned his memory of events from 19 years earlier, and suggested that his current claims were motivated by loneliness and wishful thinking rather than genuine belief. Mr. Harrison, Walsh said with barely concealed contempt, isn't it true that you've spent the past 2 decades idealizing a brief romance, and that you're now trying to transform Miss Mitchell into the daughter you never had? Daniel's response was quiet but firm. Mr. Walsh, I've spent the past 2 decades grieving for the daughter I couldn't protect and the woman I couldn't save from an impossible situation. Sarah's appearance in my life didn't create false hopes. It fulfilled ones I'd carried for 19 years. The most dramatic moment came when Robert Mitchell took the stand. His testimony as Sarah's adoptive father carried unique weight, since he had no financial interest in the outcome and every reason to protect his legal relationship with her. Mr. Mitchell, Fleming asked, in your opinion, is Sarah Harrison the biological daughter of Daniel Harrison? Robert's answer came without hesitation. Without question. I've watched that girl grow from infancy to adulthood, and I've seen Daniel Harrison's character emerge in her more clearly with each passing year. The way she thinks, the way she faces challenges, her sense of justice and determination. Those aren't learned behaviors, they're inherited traits. Walsh's attempts to shake Robert's testimony failed spectacularly. The rancher's simple honesty and obvious love for Sarah created a compelling contrast to the legal maneuvering that had characterized much of the proceedings. Mr. Mitchell, Walsh said with growing frustration, don't you have a financial interest in maintaining your legal relationship with Miss Mitchell? Robert's response silenced the courtroom. Mr. Walsh, I love that girl like she was my own blood, regardless of whose name she carries or whose money she might inherit. If supporting her claim to be a Harrison means I lose my legal standing as her father, then so be it. Her happiness matters more to me than my rights. But it was Sarah's own testimony that proved to be the turning point. Fleming had coached her carefully, but when she took the stand, she spoke with the same natural dignity that had impressed the dinner party guests weeks earlier. Miss Harrison, Fleming began, what do you hope to gain from these proceedings? Sarah looked directly at the judge as she answered, I hope to gain recognition of the truth, Your Honor, not just for my own sake, but for my mother's memory and for the principle that family bonds can't be severed by legal technicalities or social prejudices. And what would you say to those who suggest your claims are motivated by financial gain? Sarah's response carried to every corner of the packed courtroom. I would say that I've lived 18 years without the Harrison fortune and could live 18 more, but I can't live with the knowledge that my father searched for me for 19 years while I believed he was dead. I can't accept that my mother's sacrifices should be dismissed as deception rather than honored as love. Walsh's cross-examination of Sarah was his final opportunity to undermine her credibility, and he attacked with everything at his disposal. He questioned her education, her motives, her understanding of the legal implications. But Sarah met every challenge with the same combination of intelligence and grace that had won over skeptics before. "Miss Mitchell," Walsh said, deliberately using her legal name, "isn't it true that you've received substantial benefits from Mr. Harrison since making your claims? Fine clothes, expensive jewelry, accommodation in luxury that far exceeds your previous circumstances?" Sarah smiled slightly before answering. "Mr. Walsh, I've received what any father provides for his daughter: love, protection, and the opportunity to reach my potential. If you consider those benefits suspicious, then perhaps you don't understand what family means." The final argument summarized weeks of testimony and emotional revelation. Walsh painted Sarah as an opportunist, exploiting an elderly man's loneliness, while Fleming portrayed her as a young woman courageously claiming her rightful place, despite obstacles placed by greedy relatives. But it was Judge Morrison's ruling that would determine not just Sarah's future, but the broader questions of family, legitimacy and justice that the case had come to represent. "This case," the judge began after a brief recess, "has tested the boundaries between legal technicality and human truth. The court has heard compelling evidence about biological paternity, overwhelming testimony about family bonds, and disturbing suggestions about the motivations behind this challenge." Sarah felt her heart racing as Morrison continued. "The law must be precise in its requirements for proof, but it must also be wise in its recognition of human relationships that transcend legal documents." The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Morrison reached his conclusion. "Based on the testimony presented, this court finds that Sarah Catherine Harrison is indeed the biological daughter of Daniel Harrison and Mary Brennan. Furthermore, while her adoption by Robert Mitchell established important legal relationships, it does not negate her natural paternity or her right to claim that relationship." The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause as Morrison's gavel fell. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as Daniel's arms wrapped around her, while Robert's proud smile confirmed that love truly could transcend legal definitions. But Morrison wasn't finished. This court also finds that the challenge to Miss Harrison's legitimacy was motivated not by genuine legal concerns, but by financial interests that sought to manipulate the law for personal gain. Such abuse of our legal system will not be tolerated. The rebuke was devastating to Benjamin and Victoria, whose faces had gone ashen with defeat and humiliation. Their scheme had not only failed, but been exposed in the most public way possible. In the weeks that followed, the implications of the ruling rippled through Montana Territory and beyond. Sarah's victory became a symbol for women's rights advocates, inspiring other inheritance challenges and legal reforms. The story was retold in newspapers, magazines, and eventually books that chronicled the transformation of an auctioned girl into an acknowledged heiress. But for Sarah herself, the most meaningful changes were personal. She enrolled in university, courses by correspondence, began establishing schools for frontier children, and used her inheritance to support causes that reflected her values and experiences. The ranch where Robert had raised her was renovated and expanded, becoming a symbol of how wealth could be used to honor rather than abandon one's origins. Benjamin Harrison left Montana Territory permanently, his reputation so damaged that rebuilding seemed impossible. Victoria remained at the estate, but in a dramatically reduced role. her influence curtailed by Sarah's presence and her own public humiliation. 6 months after the trial, Sarah stood once again on the courthouse steps in Cedar Falls, but this time as the founder of the Sarah Harrison Foundation for Education and Women's Rights. The organization's first project was a school that would serve children from across the region, regardless of their family's circumstances or social standing. Miss Harrison, called the same reporter who had questioned her before the trial, what advice would you give to other young women facing seemingly impossible circumstances? Sarah considered the question, thinking about the journey that had brought her from auction block to philanthropist, from powerless victim to powerful advocate for change. I would tell them that the circumstances of your birth don't determine the value of your life, she said finally. I would tell them that truth has its own power, that love can survive any legal challenge, and that the courage to claim your rightful place in the world is sometimes the greatest gift you can give to those who come after you. As the sun set over the Montana territory that had shaped her story, Sarah Harrison walked toward the carriage that would take her home to the estate she now owned and the family she had fought to claim. The girl who had once faced auction as someone else's property had become a woman who owned her own destiny. The auctioneer's gavel had once threatened to seal her fate, but a judge's gavel had ultimately set her free. And in that freedom, Sarah had discovered something more valuable than any inheritance, the knowledge that identity, family, and belonging couldn't be bought, sold, or legally dissolved. They could only be claimed by those brave enough to fight for the truth of who they really were. 20 years later, when Sarah Harrison Montgomery, she had married Dr. Marcus Webb in a ceremony that united two of the territory's most progressive families, published her memoirs. She dedicated them to 3 people: Mary Brennan Harrison, who had sacrificed everything for love; Robert Mitchell, who had proven that fathers are made by choice as much as by blood; and Daniel Harrison, who had never stopped believing that family bonds were stronger than any force that tried to break them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.